Secrets and Spies presents Espresso Martini with Chris Carr and Matt Fulton.
Welcome everybody to episode 7, or should it be 007 of Espresso Martini with myself, Chris Carr, and Matt Fulton. Matt, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Chris?
I'm good. Yeah, do you know what? It's actually coming up to the 70th anniversary of James Bond and the publication of Casino Royale, so I thought it was quite fun that we are episode 7 for that anniversary, so I thought I'd just throw that in there.
Neat, yeah.
Yeah, out of interest, what was the first Bond book you ever read, or first Bond film you saw?
The first Bond book I ever read, to be honest, I haven't read many of the Ian Fleming books. The first Bond book I read, I found, this was several years ago, I found a copy of Casino Royale in a used bookstore up in the Poconos, and that was the first one I read. The first movie I saw, so there was a video like rental store back when those things existed in my town. It was called West Coast Video. I don't know if anyone listening, if that sounds familiar to them. But and it was not on the West Coast. But anyway, I would go in and like rent like all of their Bond films. I think I must have worn out a few of the VHSs.
Oh, yeah.
I want to think, what was the first one I saw? It was probably one of the Pierce Brosnan ones. That was sort of the time when I would have watched it for the first time. I know the first one I saw in theaters was The World Is Not Enough. That was kind of the first one I was of age to see in theaters.
Cool. Well, yeah, I could relate. So Casino Royale was the first book I read. I bought it actually because of the 2006 movie. So I bought that. Bought it in 2005. Actually, I've been meaning to read the Fleming books for years and sort of never really got round to it. Some of them been floating around the house. But when I heard the movie when Casino Royale was being adapted to a movie, I went out and bought the I think it was the Penguin edition of the book and sat in a cafe reading it and really enjoyed it. And then saw it with the film and compared it. And I remember when I first read the book, I thought, because there's a lot of descriptions about the card games, I thought, how on earth are they going to make that into a movie? But they did a pretty good job, I thought.
Yes.
My first Bond movie is a bit fuzzy, but I think, when I've been thinking about this for a while, trying to work out exactly what it was, because it was actually my mum who got me into Bond, but I think it was Live and Let Die, because it was on television in like 1986, 87 on ITV, and I remember one...
That's a good one.
It is a great film, and I remember as a kid, after seeing James Bond with his shaving foam taking out a snake, so it was a flamethrower shaving foam.
Yeah,
I decided to get my dad's shaving foam and try and recreate that scene, and let's just say it didn't quite end as expected.
That's the one where I think in the beginning, we're going on a crazy tangent here, but that was the one I think it was in the beginning. In like the cold open, it was like at his house.
Yeah.
It showed his house. I think that's one. I remember thinking that was so cool, like seeing Bond's just like domestic life. My like 8-year-old kind of mind being like, oh, he has like a house that he just like lives in. That's kind of strange to me. But
yeah, and with a rather elaborate coffee setup from what I remember as well.
Yes.
And his dressing gown.
Yeah.
That was good. And I think the first Bond film I saw in the cinema was GoldenEye, so I was just a couple of films ahead of you on that. But I remember that image of just Pierce Brosnan as James Bond, his stunt double jumping down off the dam, and I remember thinking that's such a cool opener. And it was actually the first film I saw after the pandemic, when we were slowly allowed out again. There's a cinema in central London called the Prince Charles that shows old movies, and it shows a lot of Bond movies, and I sort of timed it to go and see GoldenEye as my sort of return to cinema, so I thought it was a pretty cool way to start watching movies again, so there we go.
Nice.
Yeah, so it's good. Well, let us get going. So today we have a jam-packed episode, and we're going to look at a few stories that have kind of caught our eye in the world of espionage, geopolitics and intrigue, which is our area. So we're going to start with a look at Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to Russia. Our article of focus is titled China Portrays Xi's Russia Trip as a Bid for Leadership of the Non-Western World by Lily Kuo at the Washington Post. I'm just going to read a few key points that sort of jumped out from the article, and I'll come back to you, Matt, for your thoughts. So, for audiences in China, Xi's trip to Russia was a show of strength and a testament to Beijing's bid for global leadership. On the second day of his visit to Moscow, Chinese media was awash with coverage of the visit as evidence of China's mettle when it comes to standing up to Washington. Under Xi's leadership, Beijing has deployed an increasingly assertive foreign policy focused on countering what it sees as US efforts to contain China's rise as a major power. Beijing's friendship with Moscow is a key part of its strategy to establish an alternative world order that challenges US leadership and looks to China for inspiration. In an article published in Russian and Chinese during the state visit, Xi wrote that there is no country in the world that is superior to others, adding that there is no governance model that is universally applicable and there is no international order in which one country has a final say. During this important visit, there was an article that was headlined that there are 4 no's for the United States, and one of those no's is no limits on the partnership with Russia. The Gangming Daily wrote that Xi's visit would bring more understanding and support for China's independent and peace-loving foreign policy. So Matt, what are your thoughts on all of this?
It's interesting to me to see just all the pomp and circumstance that the Russians dragged out for this visit. I mean, 3 days in Moscow. I think they dined in Ivan the Terrible's chambers in the Kremlin or something. She brought like 100 staff members with him, really kind of just planting the flag down to establish the scope of their relationship, and I said this to you before that, when was the last time that you had an autocracy in Europe allied this closely with an autocracy in Asia? What did we get from that?
Yeah.
If people listening catch my drift or what I'm referring to, it wasn't good. Yeah, I think something to take out of this meeting, though, I think Xi and Putin had really divergent goals. I think Xi did it to act in kind of defiance of the international community and to say that, we can go where we want and we can meet with whoever we want. This came shortly after the International Criminal Court slapped Putin with a arrest warrant for war crimes.
Deservedly so.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think on the other hand, Putin wants to show that he's not isolated on the global stage. He desperately needs Chinese support to backfill Western sanctions. He certainly wants them to provide lethal support for his war in Ukraine. They already are providing support to some extent. I think they're providing lots of drones. There's a lot of Chinese-produced chips, computer chips that they've been cut out of Western markets for, that the Chinese are providing. At this conference, Xi spoke with Putin about this kind of 12-point peace plan for the Ukraine war that the Chinese came up with. Did you hear anything about that?
No, but I've got certainly a guest on the podcast not long ago, Matthew Orr from Rain, proposed that this Chinese peace plan's what's the word? Not malarkey, but a load of sort of nonsense. And in fact, they want to prolong the war so it keeps the US and NATO occupied.
Right. I mean, it's very kind of typical of the Chinese view of the world. They often, in negotiations with the US, they often like to use this term called the win-win. They want to find like win-win solutions for these issues, which are very kind of an insidiously coded way of how they approach things. I mean, I think the first point in their plan was they wanted to respect territorial integrity for both countries, which, I mean, would have been nice if they came out with this before Russia invaded Ukraine.
Yep.
But I think their goal here, or at least why this is appealing to Putin, I mean, the Russians are going into the second year of this war. They're desperately afraid of a new springtime offensive, which we'll probably get into a little bit later in the show. But, they have not made anywhere near the kind of gains that they wanted to. I mean, they're nowhere close to capturing Kyiv or any of the major cities in the country, although they do hold a lot more territory than they did at the beginning of the war still. But I think by and large, this strategy by the Russians and China is to sort of just freeze the war for as long as you can, kind of continue to starve the Ukrainians, just sort of wear out the patience of Western allies, and to kind of, force the Ukrainians into a negotiating position that is not nearly as strong as they would like to be in.
Yeah. I think Chinese support for Russia and its war against Ukraine does not bode well for Ukraine. On a few levels. Doesn't. I mean, as you just said, it will probably force them into a weaker position. There is also, for me, the concern, because I don't think China are currently supplying like bullets and guns. They're supplying drones, definitely. They've been supplying like MRE kits,
like non-lethal, non-lethal aid.
Yeah, and Washington obviously warned them a while back not to change that. But obviously, this meeting really is a bit of a up yours to Washington, and I think China are going to do whatever they feel like doing. So my concern is that we may end up following history from the Vietnam War, funnily enough, where China will start to supply weapons and they may even in time supply personnel. I mean, that's a bit of a leap, but there is a possibility that could happen. They certainly did that during the Vietnam War, and it could happen again. Who knows? But I think if they start supplying weapons to Russia, then I think that's a really bad thing for Ukraine, and I think that could really tip the balance of the war back in Russia's favor. I could be completely wrong, because obviously you need decent people to use those weapons, but I've always felt that Russia can still outlast and outgun Ukraine just on that level, and if Western allies start to become a bit more reluctant to supply weapons to match that, then that's not good.
Yeah,
and I think we've said it before about the US presidential elections in 2024, could determine US support in the future as well. So it's kind of concerning, really.
Well, I think this meeting also should show everyone that it's not the world, quote unquote, supporting Ukraine. It's the West supporting Ukraine, and then there's everyone else, on the other side, sort of this geopolitical Legion of Doom, I guess you could call it. And I think we in the West, in the sort of media echo chambers that we kind of inadvertently create for ourselves, especially in certain circles of Twitter, there's this false belief that's sort of been adopted that the Ukrainians are kind of just destined to win this, like they're cleaning up on the battlefield and they can't lose, and it's just a matter of time till the Russian army collapses. I mean, I remember a month after the war started, people saying, "Oh yeah, the Russian army is going to collapse any minute now," and that hasn't happened yet. I mean, they've lasted this long. No, they have not met any one of their goals that they wanted to. I mean, they wanted to take Kyiv in 2-3 days, and they're spending tens of thousands of troops trying to take Bakhmut right now. This, fairly kind of random Ukrainian village on the map.
No, indeed. Yeah. And it's another point to what you were saying about the Twitter echo chamber. I mean, like, Russia have lost an awful lot of tanks, but they've still got half left, whilst the Ukraine's struggling to get tanks at the moment. I mean, they're getting them now, but they're not going to get anywhere near the level that Russia has. They've still got something like 5,000 or 10,000 tanks left to use, and obviously they could build some more and stuff. And obviously, if China start supplying weaponry like that, it could change the balance totally. So I think it's not good. But this move also seems to be like they're strengthening the ties of Russia. And they're getting ready to circumvent the sort of US international order as we know it. And that kind of may be a precursor for their plans of Taiwan. Because if they no longer recognize the international community who are going to object to their invasion of Taiwan, then they can kind of do what they want.
Well, I think that's been the sort of looming thread in the background of this entire Ukraine war is that it's kind of, however this goes down, if it's seen as a win for the Russians in any kind of way. It makes a Chinese invasion of Taiwan in the next few years all the more likely. If they get their asses beat in Ukraine and it's a complete failure and the international community kind of holds together in their opposition to it, it makes an invasion of Taiwan a lot less likely, you know, because it shows the Chinese that this sort of 19th century kind of mindset that you could just go and just snatch the territory of neighboring countries simply because you look at it like a toddler and say, that's mine, you know, doesn't work. But yeah. I think this trip specifically to Moscow and the Chinese stance over the last couple months has just shown that, you know, repeatedly when faced with the choice of bending to U.S. pressures on something or, you know, taking a harder line on things that we don't like, if that's getting closer to Russia or the Iranians, you know, they're prepared to do it. They're prepared to go against us and do things that we would rather them not do. But I mean, at the same point, I think it's important for U.S. policymakers to keep in mind that if we're taking a vastly more adversarial stand, this is not to excuse the Chinese at all. I'm not on their side even remotely, but if we're taking a more adversarial stance towards the Chinese, whether that's a subcommittee on the House, a subcommittee in the House that's like dedicated to confronting China specifically, that's their job, or we're, you know, scrambling F-22s to shoot balloons out of the sky. If we're adopting a much more adversarial approach to the Chinese, we can't be shocked and appalled when the Chinese do adversarial things back to us. You know, I mean, maybe that's just me putting my kind of cynical realist hat on, but you know, I always say that if you're gonna throw a punch, you need to be prepared to take a punch back.
Oh yeah,
you know,
totally.
And I'd rather we be talking to them in some regard. I think that this kind of, if we're getting into this tit for tat cycle of escalation with the Chinese, where, you know, we come at them or they come back at us, and, you know, okay, in a couple steps down the road, they're supplying lethal aid to Ukraine. It's very dangerous. I mean, the Chinese, at least in their current political system, are not used to being in a long-term geopolitical rivalry with another major power. You know,
I don't think it benefits anybody to enter Cold War 2.0. Now, some could argue we're already in it. I would say we're probably in the early stages of it. I don't think we're completely in it yet. But if there is a divide between East and West again, like China, Russia versus America et al., then I just don't think that benefits anybody in the long run, especially...
No, it doesn't.
Especially with the battle for climate change, because a couple of years ago I did a really interesting episode about the national security threat that it poses, and it does. It poses a huge threat to all of us, and, you know... It's unfortunately it's got very politicized, isn't it, climate change? But
yes.
Basically the only way to resolve it is for every person, you know, every country to play its part in trying to fight it, whether that's through carbon emissions or other things too. But it's also, you know, about cooperation. And my theory is, if we do end up in a Cold War 2.0 and the world is divided, and it just becomes a war on resources, it will lead to more conflict, more open conflict. And that is my biggest fear out of this situation. That's why I don't think a Cold War 2.0 is one that, as a world, we can really afford to have, unless you're into post-apocalyptic kind of Mad Maxy kind of worlds. then fine, let's go for it. You know, let's get the Thunderdome going. You know.
Yeah, I think it does sort of, in the last couple years with China, it has sort of felt like the late 40s stages of the Cold War, if that makes sense. You know, like there's a time when we had George Kennan's long telegram, you know, come out. That sort of was the first time that someone came out and said, someone in the U.S. diplomatic community came out and said that, you know, the Soviets pose this huge existential threat to us, and we're not sort of taking it seriously. You know, I mean, I think the Soviets were in a Cold War with us several years before we were in a Cold War with them. It took us a long time to catch up. And I sort of feel that's where we are now on a whole host of issues, whether it's the economic projects, development projects that China's doing all over the world, in Africa and in the Middle East. They just brokered this kind of a rapprochement, I guess you want to call it, between Saudi Arabia and the Iranians. There's a lot that they're doing around the world right now. And I feel like we're kind of behind the ball on it.
Well, the thing is, they've become more imperial in nature, whilst the West is trying to be less imperial, is the way I see it. I think we are, and I don't think being imperial is a good thing, but because we, because the disastrous war on terror and all those kind of things, I mean, we are, I think, entering to a phase where it's becoming a battle for natural resources, which I don't think is a good thing. And I'd rather it not be a battle. I'd rather it be people politely deal with each other. And
you raise a good point there. So, I mean, in this Washington Post article that we were talking just here, that really kind of focuses on how Chinese state media covered Xi's trip to Moscow. But there's a bit in this article here that quotes something that Chinese state media said, that there is no country in the world that is superior to others. That's the Chinese view of this, which is kind of laughable when you consider how China has viewed itself through history, going back 2,000 years. They always kind of, I mean, it's the Middle Kingdom. It's above them is heaven, and below them is everyone else. If that's not an imperialist view of the world and their place in it, I don't know what is.
Well, and look at the way China's behaved. I mean, look at Tibet, look at what they want to do with Taiwan, look at the way they're treating Muslims in their own country who have a different religion. To say that they're this sort of peace-loving, I don't know, hippie-ish kind of country is what they're trying to paint themselves as. It's ridiculous. And the fact that their domestic policy is so draconian and clamps down on free speech and all those sort of things. There was a very interesting podcast listening to a while back with Sir Richard Dearlove. I for life I can't remember the name of it right now, but he's got a podcast of his own. He's former head of MI6, and he was talking about China and to an expert. And one of the fears is obviously as China becomes more of a should we say a influential force around the world, that it may in time start to expect its sort of partner countries to start adopting some of the methods that they're using to control their population. Is a fear. There's no evidence to say that's exactly what they're going to do. I haven't seen it play out in Africa and the Middle East just yet, but they certainly do pally up with countries that already seem to do that. But I don't know, in 30 years' time, when we are in this sort of more desperate stage of climate change and economic turmoil because of it, will countries turn around and start, if China says, hey, we'll rebuild your roads and do this and do that, but you've got to adopt our way of thinking in the world, a bit like what America's done with its soft power, trying to promote freedom and democracy. China might be trying to promote the opposite. And I think that's a concern, and a real concern. I've spoken to a few people who express that, and they're people I respect. And I think there is a real possibility that could happen, potentially.
Well, that's another good point here that is sort of kind of laughably raised in this article that she wrote about the trip, where he said that there's no country in the world that is superior to others. But he also says right after this that there is no governance model that is universally applicable, and there is no international order in which one country has the final say. Yeah. Which you would look at that and just think, well, okay, fine. I mean, I think that countries have the right to self-determination, and if their people decide, not under duress, not at gunpoint, that, this is the sort of destiny that they want to have, if they want to be closer to the West or not, people have the right to self-determination. That's their to choose. But if your governance model, if your international order, which you envision and champion, is one that you lock up Muslims in concentration camps, or you weld people inside their apartments, in the middle of a pandemic. If you drastically limit the kind of speech that is acceptable for your people to use, I mean, that's an international order that I think we fought and won World War II to establish that that we as a species kind of don't tolerate, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, I do think, people have the right to self-determination. Not every country in the world is kind of destined or meant to be a liberal democracy in the style of Western countries, you know? But I still think there is some kind of just basic understanding of human rights and personal freedoms that I would think in the post-war world that we've sort of established and gotten past, you know?
Yeah.
But I don't know, we're 70, almost 80 years removed from World War II, and maybe that kind of idea slips after a while. I think looking at where we are as a society in the US right now and our system of government and sort of what it's gotten us after, 200 plus years, I mean, we are, I think, in the US right now, incredibly dysfunctional. We are dysfunctional to the point of being nigh ungovernable. We hate each other. We can barely coexist with each other in the US right now. Yeah. And I don't know if we'll be okay. But the difference is I can still say that about my country and the Chinese can't. Yeah.
I was thinking about this very point this morning, because if we are entering in this sort of phase of a more adversarial relationship with China, as you were saying, we're not united at this time. Whether that's by foreign influence or not, I would say it's probably a little bit of that, but I would say that the majority of the issues are issues that have pre-existed, and these are issues that, unfortunately, when you put them online in a black and white cold text, etc., that they start to become intolerable, and we haven't sort of found a way to deal. So I'm getting really off on a tangent, but we haven't really found a way to sort of deal with. Everybody has different value systems and different different opinions on things, and we haven't found a kind of constructive way to get past that. Now, there are some very nasty things that have come out in the last 20 years, like sort of closet racism and probably more overt racism than we realised in some parts of society as well. And and obviously, I can't remember who it once said, but in a way, we've got to clean up our own act a bit, and then if we're going to be able to be in a situation where we can, I don't know, it's getting a bit lovey-dovey this, but where we can heal and move forward, because as a society, we're not in a good place right now because we're not all on the same page. And the thing is, this is the scary thing. We talked about this with the Russia stuff a while back. The far right at the moment seem to be unifying a lot more people in sort of law enforcement and military. These are the very people we rely on to defend us and our values. And they, for some reason or another, seem to be giving a more compelling case and drawing those people in. And that's dangerous, because if all the people in the military who are supposed to be protecting us are actually all believing in the far right and sort of Putin's vision of the world, that doesn't bode well either. And obviously it's a bit of a generalization, because not everybody in the military or the police are far right white supremacists, far from it.
Right.
But there is a growing thing that we're seeing, especially like in Germany, with members of the security services who are suddenly loyal to Russia, and it turns out they have far right leanings, or like that British security guard in the Berlin embassy who was arrested last year. And I've seen, we've seen other stories too of like members of special forces and things like that in Germany, and I think in the US, who have some leanings to the far right. And heck, you're seeing it, and you see it obviously in Russia, and that's concerning, and that's a big problem we're going to have to deal with as well. That kind of feeds into all this, and that's it's a bit of a mishmash of things there. So I hope people keep track of what I'm saying. But I suppose my ultimate point is that, we've got to find a way to kind of bring those people back, because if we need those people to defend us and our values, they need to be people who believe in those values too. And I'm kind of like, and I think because of that 2015 period, I feel like it's where in America and to some extent Britain really has lost the plot a bit because of Brexit and Trumpism, to the point where now families are divided, people are not speaking to each other. And then like with Trump being arrested just earlier this week, and there was a flag saying "Death or Trump" That's really worrying, and that's not a small. That is a sort of a. People used to be able to laugh it off, but I think we're past the point where we can laugh off wacky conspiracy theorists and people with kind of pro-Trump views. And it to me it shows a vulnerability. That's probably the point I'm getting at after all that word salad there. But.
Right. Well, I think if I were to try to draw a connection between the sort of temperament and worldview of communist China, I'll just say it, fascist Russia, or the far right in the West, I would say that, the Chinese argument against the post-war Western liberal system of government is that they would say that it's chaos, that it's the chaos of the commons, and there is no sort of central voice governing and bringing a common vision together to sort of drive this society forward. And the Chinese would say that their system of government, you don't have these personal freedoms, but in exchange, you have a relative degree of affluence and safety. I mean, the Chinese have drawn tens of millions of people out of poverty in the last few decades, So they would say that that's the benefit that our system of government has that the West does not, And I think what you're seeing a lot with the far right in the US especially, and I think in the West at large, is they're sort of coalescing around this idea now that, okay, they've tried to sort of push their policies forward at the ballot box. They've tried to buy into democracy, and it hasn't so much worked for them because they see themselves sort of losing the share of the popular vote, I guess you could say, over the last couple decades. And in response to that, they're sort of now jettisoning their embrace of democracy and going like, okay, well, we have this view of how society should be in the US or in, some Western European country, and that's straight, white, Christian, very kind of specific, like it's if live your life the way we tell you to live and will allow you to exist, is kind of their position now, and they're trying to kind of enforce that system, whether it's banning books in schools that say things that they don't like, or if it's gerrymandering districts so that the sort of entrenched minority rule. It's threatening to, next time they come back in power, purge the government of all sort of career appointed bureaucrats and installing them with people who align with them politically. It's that same kind of an enforced shaping of society by any means necessary,
and defunding the FBI and all that.
Defunding the FBI and DOJ because, we should be able to commit any crime that we want without any repercussions. I mean, I think that's what these movements right now have in common, and it just comes down to autocracy.
Yeah, and that's it. We're in that battle now between democracy and autocracy, whether it be domestically or internationally. I think that's
and I mean to sort of, I guess, put a cap on this conversation we've been on here. That's, I think you're seeing the contours of the geopolitical world for the foreseeable future. Okay, since the end of the Cold War, you've maybe had this unipolar world order where the United States is kind of the lone hyperpower, and it's been unchallenged for the last sort of 30 years, and the Western worldview of small d democracy, maybe that is fading a bit. I mean, that's not the last 30 years. The system that we've had in the last 30 years is kind of not the norm. It's a bit of an aberration if you look throughout history. So we are kind of reverting back into a world where you'll have two kind of very powerful ideologies in competition with each other. And like I said, when was the last maybe kind of tie this off in the way that we started this. When was the last time that you had a powerful autocracy in Europe allied with a powerful autocracy in Asia?
Yeah.
You know?
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you for that. So let's segue into another article. It's titled China Waging a Decades-Long Spy War by Calder Walton for Foreign Policy.
Listeners should definitely go read this article. It's really good, really kind of level-headed, balanced look at the threat that Chinese intelligence poses to the West.
Oh, definitely. And in the show notes, this article is available. So I was going to read a few key points that sort of jumped out. And Calder's got a new book coming out soon called Spies, and he will be a guest on the podcast talking about that. We're just sorting it out in the moment.
Sounds quite interesting.
Yeah, it's going to be epic, I think. It looks quite long, and he's been traveling all over the place.
Nice.
To this article, so China's Ministry of State Security, the MSS, had a long-term aim, which was to contain the United States and then supplant it in Southeast Asia. After 9/11 attacks, as the United States was focused on terrorism in the Middle East, the MSS saw its chance to act. As a result, gains have been made by the MSS, and they've went largely undetected or appreciated by US intelligence. Chinese intelligence was soon winning its war on US spies. In 2010, the MSS dismantled a major CIA network that was being run from its station in Beijing. It reportedly led to the killing or imprisonment of more than a dozen CIA sources in China. Details of how the Chinese compromised the US network remain murky. It seems, however, that the MSS hacked into the CIA's supposedly secure communication channels, and there are also whispers that there may have been a human agent, a mole, to use John le Carre's phrase, in the CIA. That person may have been Jerry Lee, who's a former CIA case officer who was working on Chinese affairs. After leaving the CIA, Lee sold US secrets to Chinese intelligence, and he was later caught in a US counterintelligence success, and in 2019 he was sentenced to 19 years in prison. There is little information in the public domain about what secrets Lee delivered to his Chinese handlers. Unlike those in Western democracies, China's intelligence services are not held to account by independent political bodies or the public, nor are they subject to the rule of law. China, by contrast, thanks to successive national security legislation passed under President Xi Jinping, Chinese businesses are now required to work with its intelligence services whenever requested to do so. China's unprecedented economic boom this century has been fueled by an equally unprecedented theft of Western science and technology. Back in 2012, the director of the US National Security Agency warned that cyber espionage constituted the greatest transfer of wealth in history. A recent report by Strider Technologies, an open-source strategic intelligence startup, has revealed how Chinese scientists were able to obtain valuable research and development from Los Alamos, home to the US government's cutting-edge laboratories. The report, which demonstrates the power of open-source intelligence in today's digital world, reveals that Chinese scientists at Los Alamos brought R&D back from there to China, which the Chinese government then used in defense technologies such as hypersonics. In some instances, the Chinese scientists at Los Alamos had been funded by US research grants. So the United States was thus effectively funding its own competitive disadvantage with China in these sectors. And I'll just cap off with, according to the FBI, in 2021, it was opening a China-related investigation every 12 hours. Even Britain's traditionally secret services, MI5 and MI6 and GCHQ, have come out of the shadows and publicly warned about the threat posed by Chinese espionage. And the article ends that we need a conversation about Chinese espionage, and it adds that now is a moment for nuance and not grandstanding. So, Matt, do you have any thoughts that are nuanced and not grandstanding?
I want to get that sentence like tattooed on my forehead. Now is a time for nuance and not grandstanding.
It's a good one, isn't it? And I can't ask Calder's sentence. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is a great article. And like I said, I would encourage everyone listening to run, not walk, to go read this. I think it does an excellent job of sort of laying out the threat that Chinese intelligence has posed in the last 20 years. I mean, this article talks about how in 2005 the Ministry of State Security kind of declared war on U.S. intelligence. And there's a really great Chinese proverb that he describes it. My Mandarin is non-existent, so I won't attempt to pronounce it, but it roughly translates to watch the fires burn from the safety of the opposite riverbank, which allows you to avoid entering the battle until your enemy is exhausted. I mean, I haven't read my Sun Tzu since high school, which should tell you how weird I was in high school. But, I mean, this goes directly in line with that kind of teaching, and we, in the last segment, we talked a bit about the war on terror and how, we were so focused on, I think rightly to an extent, combating Al-Qaeda and the threat posed by jihadism, that, we kind of, we missed the ball on the Chinese, that we're bogged down in Iraq, in Afghanistan, spending, hundreds of billions of dollars with very little to show for it. Meanwhile, the Chinese have been, running rinks around us, whether it's industrial espionage or, weeding its way into various kind of academic circles and building influence that way. I think there's elsewhere in this article, he sort of says that we need to kind of have a honest conversation about the influence of or the role or the place, I guess, that Chinese nationals have in U.S. universities. And he doesn't say that like we should ban them. We should ban Chinese students from studying in U.S. universities. But there is kind of, I mean, I'll be honest, there is a point there that, okay, Chinese nationals are coming to the U.S. studying in, the best universities in the world, which is a draw to the U.S., that we have the best universities in the world, especially when it comes to fields in science and technology. I mean, we're kind of unmatched there, that we would educate them, and then they're going to get back on a flight and go back and use that education against us,
And there's been countless examples of that.
Yeah, I mean,
loads you could,
I think if you're a foreign national and you come to the U.S. to study at, Stanford or MIT or Caltech or something, and you have this kind of, we imbue in you this advanced knowledge and capability, we should staple a green card to your degree.
Yeah, there's something in that.
Yeah, hopefully they stay here and work for us, and that doesn't mean that they go work for the NSA, I'm not saying that, but go work for Apple or Google or SpaceX,
Yeah. Well, this is it. I think there are a lot of people with good intentions over the last of 20, 30 years to, who've in a sense sort of, I suppose in that hopeful 90s period, which, increasingly looking back on with rose tinted glasses now, but in the 90s, there was this sort of feeling that we're past division, we're past nationalism, we're past this, that, and the other. And sadly, maybe some of us are past that and many of us are not. And obviously, as Calder's article points out, Chinese businesses and then students and so on are being co-opted or kind of made to work with Chinese intelligence for less than pure aims, and we have to be realistic about that. We can't be naive about that, and it's just trying to find that kind of balanced way, like you were just suggesting, with what's the incentive if we have people from China come and go to our universities and stuff. What is the incentive for them to stay here and not take that knowledge back and use it just for China's advantage? Is a difficult one, hence the need for nuance. I don't know what the answer to that is. I wish I did. Maybe one day we'll come up with it on this podcast, usually after a few drinks of martinis, but we might have the answer. But I think also people can't be naive anymore. People need to understand that sadly there is a threat, and they need to consider that in business. There's been examples of sort of business people abroad who've been compromised by honey traps, or they get involved in a very lucrative deal that suddenly pans out to being a front for Chinese intelligence, or even members of parliament have being caught up by donors, both Russian and Chinese. Certainly in the UK, we had a scandal, I think about a year ago, involving, I think it was a Labour MP who had been paid off by a person of influence who had connections to the Chinese government. I think some people just don't consider this as even a possibility. Certainly, I know, a lot of people in my social circle definitely think still in a very 90s framework. They still think the world is this sort of happy, loving, very progressive place that where nationalism and things like that don't exist anymore, and we're the only aggressor in the world now. And I just think those days have passed. I don't think that attitude really works anymore. There's certain aspects of it we could aspire to. I think the world should be a more inclusive and nice place, and nationalism not such a big deal. But I may want that, but that's not the world we're currently in, sadly. But there we go. But a couple of points I was going to bring up. Obviously, the Biden administration has taken this threat quite seriously, and they've set up the China Mission Center, which William Burns at the CIA created last year. We've also had recently this Chinese spy balloon episode. It's been a very provocative and symbolic move by China. And reportedly, China's balloon was equipped with state-of-the-art sensors capable of eavesdropping on electronic signals from near space that satellites could not. So that was quite interesting.
Can I make a point real quick there with that?
Yeah, please, go for it.
So this new information came out about the Chinese spy balloon that it was collecting signals intelligence from military facilities that could not be collected from the higher altitude that a satellite would be at. And if you recall, when, back in February, when we talked about this, I brought up the point that it flew right over the Dakotas, where U.S. Strategic Command has all its missile fields. And I kind of hypothesized with no evidence whatsoever that they could potentially be interested in the communications between these silos and its kind of control stations. Again, this article doesn't say that's what they were looking at, but what it does say that the spy balloon was collecting intelligence on definitely falls within that kind of scope.
Can you hear that?
Yes.
Matt was right. Hang on. Yeah.
I don't know that I was right. I don't know that I was right. But I wasn't proven wrong. I'll say that.
No. So there we are. We got something right on this podcast. Hey, finally.
Yeah. But anyway, 7
sorry,
episodes. Not to interrupt you. You
no.
your other points.
Not at all. No, not at all. So, so the Chinese spy balloon thing's quite provocative. So, my last point, kind of similar to the point I've just made, is if we are entering this new Cold War type situation, with it being the Western order versus the Chinese Russia order, we can no longer afford to be naive about these things. We're sadly not in this hopeful 1990s period. As much as I'd prefer us to be, we're definitely not. So we need to find, as Calder said, a sort of nuanced, non-grandstanding way of dealing with this. We don't want to end up with what the Trump administration did with its China flu nonsense, because that led to a rise in hate crimes against Asian people. And this is the worrying thing. We don't want to repeat ugly history. I know with internment camps with World War II and Japanese people, and Asian Americans, we've got to make sure it never happens. And bloody hell, citizens need to fucking grow up a little bit and stop attacking random people who may look like somebody you perceive as your enemy. It's really, I don't know how we deal with that. That's the scary thing about the situation. And it's a bit like what happened in the war on terrorism with Islam. The problem is it feeds into the hands of Muslim extremists every time a racist goes and beats up a random Muslim. And it's going to be the same thing every time a white American beats up an Asian American, or a white British person beats up an Asian British person. It just plays into the hands of China, if you want to call them our enemy or not, but in that situation, it's not good.
Well, Calder makes the point here too that Chinese diasporas worldwide are kind of some of the biggest victims of Chinese intelligence operations. Routinely kind of harassed, or their families back within China are subjected to all kinds of nasty things. And I think that's important to keep in mind. I've seen studies before in the past that suggest that Chinese diaspora communities in the U.S. and in the U.K. too aren't quite as nationalistic as it's not like they see themselves as subjects of Xi Jinping's Communist Party first above all else. That's not where they are, and I think it's important that we don't. To your point, that a lot of these sort of, strict stances that we took against Muslim communities after 9/11, that played into the hands of jihadists. And I think it's important now that our policies towards China don't play into the hands of the Chinese sort of trying to nationalize diaspora communities abroad. I think it's important.
Just not confident our society's in that place right now. Because I look at, I was just reading, I think it was this morning, about Gurkha security guards who worked in Afghanistan are now potentially going to get deported.
That's terrible.
And it's like, Britain has this terrible history of not looking after people who look after us sometimes when they don't look white.
Yeah.
And it's not good. And obviously with, there are examples under the Trump administration where similar sort of things have sort of happened.
It's like the new Scottish First Minister.
Yeah.
That people were like, oh no, he's, brown. But he was born and raised in Glasgow. He's just as Scottish as I don't know, anyone else born in Scotland, And a lot of those diaspora communities in the UK, Jamaicans, British, Pakistanis and stuff, their families were encouraged to come over immediately after World War II to fill these sort of labor shortages. They came here to do y'all a favor.
Yeah, and I can tell you now, I've spoken to people, who are, should we say, politely right-wing, not necessarily far right, but just right-wing, who see those people as not being British. My view has always been, if you've got a British passport, you're British, and obviously if you change your passport to Canadian, then you're Canadian, whatever. It's not a big deal. But there's something missing in Britain that somehow... there's a very monoculture way of thinking when we in reality are a multicultural society. Now, Britain obviously statistically has a huge white population versus minority populations, because we just had a census come out last year. Came out this year. It was done 2 years ago. And it's just like we need... I don't know why... Now, 80 years after World War II, when World War II, a lot of nations came to, help us all out, that we still can't find a way to be inclusive. I just don't understand why, even through this wonderful period of the 90s that we look with rose-tinted glasses where nationalism didn't matter anymore and all that sort of stuff, we've not made a concerted effort in Britain to make people feel British. I just don't understand it. And I think the part of the problem, maybe, is certainly on the left, nationalism's a sort of dirty word. When we should be thinking about inclusive nationalism, maybe. And certainly on the right, you've got the whole the connection to the far right and just this sort of racist monoculture way of looking. But then saying that, at the moment, the Conservative government, which is in a sense a right-wing party, probably has the most inclusive government that we've ever had in this country. So, it's all a bit messy in terms of left right wing political spectrum on this matter, but something, I don't know quite what the answer is, but something needs to change in British society, certainly, if we're going to be robust enough to come up with nuanced, should we say, adult policies that will counter the genuine threat from Chinese espionage and an aggressive Chinese government in the future.
Well, to your point there about nationalism, I think this article, Calder, does a good job at pointing out the sort of built-in kind of inherent advantages that Chinese intelligence operations have against us, whereby, the U.S. doesn't engage in U.S. intelligence services don't engage in industrial espionage to the benefit of U.S. businesses, which I think is kind of surprising to most people, but they don't. Whereas functionally, there's no daylight between the Ministry of State Security or the PLA and any Chinese company. You know, I mean, yeah, kind of they're functionally separate until the phone call comes from Beijing saying, "Hey, we need you to do this thing." You know, we don't have that. I mean, yeah, if a businessman travels to Beijing and the CIA, you know, gets wind that they might have seen or heard or experienced something over there that could be useful to us, the CIA has a National Resources Division which will go and interview them, you know, but they won't. They're not that's not under penalty of imprisonment, or their family won't be harassed if they don't cooperate. You know, we don't act that way.
No, it's voluntary. It's voluntary.
Right, yeah. right. The Chinese have gone through pains to sort of adopt this total information dominance approach to controlling their society. I mean, I think I saw a figure recently that there's 400 million surveillance cameras in mainland China.
Oh, wow. With facial recognition technology as well, isn't it?
With facial recognition tied up to these AI algorithms that sort of go through and sort all this stuff in ways that you and I and most listeners can't even conceive.
Somebody call Orwell, quick. He's needed.
Right. But you think also, I mean, okay, if you're a Chinese spy operating in the West, I mean, the U.S. and several Western European countries, they are multiracial, multicultural, largely affluent, open societies where it's easy for someone who quite doesn't necessarily look like what most people look like in that country to operate, you know, whereas China is not, and they just have the manpower, you know, hundreds of thousands of intelligence officers and police officers at their disposal that makes operating in China for Western intelligence incredibly difficult. I mean, this article talks about how in 2010, the CIA's sort of spy ring in Beijing was rolled up. I don't know to what extent we've rebuilt that, but I mean, the ability to operate in China, incredibly difficult, and I don't know how the CIA overcomes it. I'm sure they have means. I mean, that's something else. I think it's very easy for us to get into this kind of woe is us. How do we possibly confront this threat? They're so much bigger and badder. They're so much bigger and badder than us, which, if we want to go back to sort of what we were talking before, that we're kind of in the beginning stages of the Cold War. I mean, for a long time during the Cold War, you know, we had this huge inferiority complex with the Soviets. You know, we thought they were so much more powerful than us, you know, but that never really was, you know, after the Cold War, when the veil was sort of opened, that was never really the case. You know, there was no missile gap. A lot of those tanks you saw rolling through Red Square were made of wood. You know, these missiles were made of wood. They weren't real. I think it's important to, while this threat is real and has to be confronted seriously with nuance, like Calder says, I think it's also important that we don't entirely sell ourselves short. I think while the Chinese intelligence services have incredible capabilities, I would venture to say that our own intelligence capabilities are incredible, and I think would surprise most people with what we're able to do.
Well, I would say evidence of that is Ukraine. I think like the way, to me, from about 2010 to up to the Ukraine war, it kind of had a feeling that the Western intelligence are on the back foot, that we're all a bit behind and Russia's doing really well, because obviously Russia had a lot of very public successes. And then when the Ukraine war happened, suddenly we're in a situation where we know an awful lot about what's going on in Russia. We know an awful lot about Russian motivations, which to me not only is signals intelligence, but is human resources too. That we've got defectors coming out left, right and centre all the time. And the thing is, with totalitarian sort of regimes, if we're going to call China that, which I think, to an extent it is, you can't trample down human nature. There are going to be petty rivalries that can be exploited. There are going to be Muslims who are offended by the way China clamps down on their religion and has clamped down on Muslims. Even though Saudi Arabia and Iran and Turkey to some extent are doing their best to cozy up to China, ordinary day-to-day Muslims are going to kind of see through that. That's political. And a lot of Muslims I know still don't really sort of see eye to eye with Saudi Arabia or Iran anyway, let alone, so I don't think Iran or Saudi Arabia really speaks for Muslims. So there's that can be exploited as well. Sorry, I'm just thinking as a spy master now, but there's all sorts of stuff. And the other thing as well, one thing that I would say that was Britain and America's advantage over the Germans during World War II was creative thinking, because again, with these sort of totalitarian regimes, you kind of push people in a very robotic direction, and also you end up becoming yes men just for your survival, and that's dangerous. And like we've seen, our drinking game, get ready, Oleg Gordievsky's book talks about how they, as the KGB, were instructed to write reports in a certain way that would be read favorably in the Kremlin. So they were basically giving a load of nonsense to the Kremlin and painting a false picture, which again, Putin's a victim of at the moment. He's isolated himself, and so it's not working out well for him. So I think there's an awful lot going for the West. I don't think the West is a total dysfunctional disaster.
No.
I think we could always be better. But one thing that I suppose makes me, other than obviously being born here, but makes me very pro-West, is the fact that as a society, yes, we're imperfect and we're always in a conversation about how we could be better. And I think that's a real strength.
Yeah.
Sometimes we forget to celebrate what we've got right, and I think that's something we could do better at, because there's a lot of things that we do well, and there are an awful lot of things that we could do better. And I think that that's one of the strengths of the West. I'll put it there.
But see, a strength of the West, too, is that you and I can have this discussion right now,
Yeah.
and this podcast won't be wiped off the web, and we won't mysteriously disappear for a couple months and then show up again, singing the praises of Xi Jinping's brilliance, You and I can say, yeah, our society is kind of fucked in certain ways, and we have these challenges, but we can have an honest conversation and try to better ourselves, whereas people in these totalitarian societies cannot.
No, exactly. And that's a huge difference there. So I think it's something we should not forget as it all falls apart. But anyway, yeah. So we'll segue into our final article of today. So there was a great article in The Guardian by Andrew Roth and Pjotr Sauer for The Guardian. Russian defector sheds light on Putin's paranoia and his secret train network. Now, there is something about presidents and trains. Maybe we'll come back to that later. So a former security officer tells of President Putin's strict quarantine and says he has lost touch with the world. Gleb Karakulov, who served as a captain of the Federal Protection Service, the FSO, a powerful body tasked with protecting Russia's highest-ranking officials. So Karakulov was a member of a field team of the Presidential Communications Directorate that encrypts messages of top Russian officials and estimates he travelled on more than 180 trips. He appears to be the highest-ranking intelligence official to defect since the start of Russia's war with Ukraine. Putin has identical offices across the country that disguise his whereabouts, and he also reportedly has a secret train network because it cannot be tracked by any information resources. It's done for stealth purposes. Karakulov describes a virtual state within a state that includes firefighters, food tasters, and other engineers who travel with Putin on his trips abroad, providing a rare first-hand insight into the levels of paranoia and sheltered lifestyle of the Russian president. They call him the boss, worship him in every way, and only ever talk of him in those terms, he said. He went on to say that our president has lost touch with the world. He's been living in an information cocoon for the past couple of years, spending most of his time in his residences, which the media very fittingly call bunkers. He is pathologically afraid for his life. He surrounds himself with an impenetrable barrier of quarantines and in an information vacuum, and he only values his own life and the lives of his family and friends. Well, that bit's nice to know, that he does value his family and friends. But anyway, and he confirmed that Putin relies heavily on information on reports provided by his security services. Putin does not use a mobile phone or the internet, and he doesn't even bring an internet specialist with him on foreign trips. He only receives information from his closest circle. So we're seeing a pattern here, which means that he lives in an information vacuum. He said that Putin's behavior and lifestyle had altered since the outbreak of the coronavirus in 2020, when the president retreated from most travel and public appearances. While the strict quarantine regime has fueled rumors that Putin may be seriously ill, Karakulov has said that there are no indications that Putin was in poor health. So, Matt, any thoughts on any of that?
Well, I really geek out on these articles that kind of show behind the curtain, just at, like, the mechanics of how this stuff works. I find that really interesting and just valuable, for active measures for my books that I'm writing. This is very cool to see. I want to say this guy, Karakulov, is incredibly brave. I said to you offline when we were discussing the outline for the show that I really hope this guy doesn't like tea, if you catch my drift.
Yeah.
I mean, just because he came from the FSO, which, if listeners don't know, that's the Federal Protective Services, which was one of the chief directorates of the KGB. I don't remember off the top of my head which one. That when it was split up, they were all made into separate agencies. But the FSO is incredibly powerful. It's like the Secret Service, but on steroids to an incredible degree. I mean, they operate. It talks about this article talks about his Putin's dacha right outside to the west of Moscow, Novo-Ogaryovo, and his residence in the Black Sea, Bacharov Rushai, I believe is how you pronounce it. But I mean, he basically doesn't leave this kind of hermetically sealed cocoon that he lives in. I mean, to an extent, the heads of most nuclear powers kind of live this way. I mean, Biden kind of lives in a hermetically sealed bubble too, but I don't think he's walled off from information that would upset him. I mean, I know someone who works in the West Wing, so I can say that he's definitely not walled off from information that would upset him.
Does he get upset then?
But I'm sure he gets upset.
Yeah.
He's Irish Catholic. He definitely gets upset about things. But this is, I mean, so the FSO kind of operates this entirely separate kind of world. So there's these two residents that he has. Somewhere in this article, it talks about the dacha that he has in the Valdai National Park, which I featured in part 1 of Active Measures.
Hey.
Plug.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's all kinds of there's health resorts and stuff that are sort of set aside for Russian elites. This armored train that he travels around in is very interesting to me. I don't recall hearing about this train before it was reported during the war.
No.
That he was moving around it. That's new to me.
No, it kind of makes me think of GoldenEye, but anyway.
Yeah. There's something with crazed dictators and armored trains that's just so retro in kind of a funky way.
It is, and presidents and trains, because obviously Biden and his trip to Kyiv.
Oh yeah, he took the main train. This is very neat. There's just a lot of cool little anecdotes that's in this article about just how he kind of lives, and it definitely kind of tracks with a lot of the reporting on Putin's mental state since in the lead up to and after the invasion started, that, since COVID, he's just been so incredibly isolated. I mean, there's continue to be all these rumors about he may or may not be in various states of poor health. I don't know to what extent that's true. I mean, he seems to still be chugging along just fine. Unfortunately, it seems like the worst ones never drop dead when you want them to.
A lot of UK tabloids have been obsessed about Putin's health, and even Sir Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6, at one point was speculating about Putin's health, and there was some headline like Putin will drop dead in 6 months and blah blah blah. And I've always been, I think I've said this before, I've always been very cautious about those things, because I think traditionally during like conflicts or whatever, it's quite there's a tendency in the press to demonize the leader of the other country, or to put out nonsense. I remember when 9/11 happened and there was like the News of the World put out something about bin Laden. Was it like Tagliatelle pasta? He's a fan of was it Manchester United or Liverpool? I can't remember which one it was. And then there was some derogatory thing about his health and whatever. I can't remember what it was now. But these sort of things sort of float around during times of conflict, and most of them are nonsense.
This goes back a long time. I mean, there was during World War II, there was a lot of stories about Hitler having syphilis, or he was missing one of his testicles or something, and that was I mean, pretty much drawn up by the OSS or the SOE, and sort of planted in the press. So yeah, I think it seems very real that Putin is incredibly isolated and kind of surrounds himself with yes men that out of subservience or just fear only tell him the things that he wants to hear, which led to the disastrous year that his army has faced in Ukraine. Yeah, I mean, nothing but respect for this Mr. Gleb Karakulov. I would curious to see what the future holds for him.
Yeah, I know. Wouldn't it be great to try and get him on? But I don't know if that will happen because he's at a security risk, so it's going to be very hard to get hold of him. But we will try.
Yeah, I would think he's going to be in hiding for a long time.
Yeah,
the Russians will not forget. The Russians will not forget about him.
No, this is it. The Russian intelligence services. You've got operatives all over the world. We've seen countless examples that they do like to kill defectors now. They didn't during the Cold War so much, but they certainly post Litvinenko, they don't seem to give a monkeys anymore. They seem to just be very brazen about it. So I think he needs to, he needs to be very careful for his health there. So there we go. But no, I think, as you were saying, I think this article confirms a lot of things that we've suspected. I think, Putin went a little bit Howard Hughes during the pandemic. When most people were kind of trying to cope with a bit of cookery or watching Netflix, he kind of played to his inner demons and paranoia, which has culminated in this dreadful war in Ukraine. And as we're saying, Putin's surrounded by yes men, which is never a good thing. And I suppose one thing that did pop into my head as well with all this is I can't say this picture painted of Putin fills me with confidence about how he would react if he's in a kind of no-win situation and kind of cornered. It does make me wonder if he still has the potential to go nuclear on us. I mean, people tell me that there are fail-safes in place to kind of stop that, but I don't know. Yeah. I'm not completely confident about that. But
there's a lot of anticipation for this spring offensive that the Ukrainians are supposed to go on shortly, and there's evidence recently that the Russians are quite concerned about their security situation in Crimea. They're digging all these networks of trenches in the last couple of weeks or so. Yeah. So it shows that they're quite nervous about what's to come soon. I mean, you and I have talked about this in the past, that I think when when the Ukrainians are able to credibly threaten Crimea, whether that's seizing the peninsula or making life untenable there for the people who live there, like making Crimea a frontline battlefield. I think that would be if and when that happens, that'll be the beginning of the end of the war. And that'll bring the Russians to the negotiating table in a way that's actually kind of earnest. Like you might get a real kind of negotiated end to the war. However, when and if Crimea is threatened, I think that'll be the most dangerous phase. And that's when kind of the only time I would believe that Putin could use some kind of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield. However, if we do move into that space, we'll know we'll know very easily. And you'll see the White House and NATO start flipping out. It won't be a surprise to us if we move into that space.
No, and I think there was a point I was going to make earlier, which I completely forgot to make. I don't think we can rely on China to rein Russia in. I'm
not really,
and I think this is so I think because a lot of people have sort of speculated that China might be able to do that, but I'm not sure that they completely can really.
I'm not sure,
but we'll see.
Yeah.
Time will tell. But I mean, I'm hoping it doesn't end in Doctor Strangelove 2.0 happening, because I enjoyed the original. I don't think I need a remake. But there we go. Well, Matt, I think we've covered as much as we possibly can. There's so much more.
Yes.
Everybody, thank you so much for listening. So our plan is to do 2 episodes a month. So we would love to hear from you. So Matt and I will talk about maybe doing an Ask Us Anything section. And also, if you want to suggest topics, send in an article that you've read, or even have suggestions for people who might be interesting for us to interview, drop us an email at secretsandspiespodcast@gmail.com. That's secretsandspiespodcast@gmail.com. I'll put it in the show notes as well. You can also at us on Twitter by just going to Secrets and Spies. We're also now on Instagram. Just at us at Secrets and Spies on Instagram. We are also on Facebook, and that is also Secrets and Spies. All the links to our social media is in the show notes. So if you click on your app, goes to the show notes, you can get everything there. As also will the articles will be there as well. If you go to secretsandspiespodcast.com, you can click on every individual link and still get our show notes, because I've noticed on some podcast apps sometimes it seems to cut off the show notes. So if you experience a cut off, just go to our website and it's all there. But Matt, before we go, are you up to anything interesting over the next few days? We've got the Easter break coming up. I'm personally not a practicing Christian. I'm not anything, but I do enjoy eating chocolate and hanging out with family. So are you up to anything exciting?
I think I'm going over my cousin's house for brunch on Sunday. Easter's not really a big deal for us anymore either. I mean, it was when I was smaller. But yeah, it's usually pretty chill. Yeah, I got this kind of big research project for a top secret thing that I'm working on and taking up a bunch of my time. Yeah, that's pretty much it for me. How about you? And you got some exciting things going on, probably not that you want to talk about right now.
Yeah, well, I'll mention a little bit to listeners, but I won't say too much. But I mean, I've got a film project that sort of attracted the interest of a producer, and so we're kind of just ironing out those details. So once more info comes out, I will publicly share more about that, but it's in relation to the themes of this podcast. So
nice.
And it's a relatively new script. It's only we've been working on it for about 2 years now, so it's nice to finally see it's going somewhere. So watch this space. I think keep your fingers crossed for us, because obviously if this does get made, it'd be really helpful and really help get other projects off the ground, because I mean, both Matt and I are both writers, and we're both sort of, whilst we're not doing this and whilst we're doing our day job earning cash, we're sort of both trying to write scripts and books and so on that will hopefully entertain you all and provide some interesting insight into the world of espionage and the people involved in it. And there's a few things I'm working on and trying to figure out that will hopefully be an interesting addition to the world of spy fiction. I hope that's my aspiration. So there's some exciting things going on there, but away from all that, I think this weekend just catching up with my wife and some of her family, and having a bit of chocolate and maybe a bit of alcohol too. And hopefully a nice lunch. I think Easter Sunday we're supposed to go and see some relatives for lunch. That'd be nice. And then and then sort of keeping an eye on the crazy world that we live in, and trying to keep yourself sane. Really, definitely be. Hopefully, there should be a new season of Bosch Legacy coming out soon, because it usually comes out around Easter time. So might keep an eye out for that. I finally watched the first season of Slow Horses, so I probably should try and watch season 2.
Oh, I still got to do that. I know there's been like several months in a row that at the end of these episodes we're like, oh yeah, Slow Horses. I still haven't watched it.
And there's another show called The Citadel, which is supposed to be a futuristic spy show. I can't say
That's interesting.
Yeah, I can't say the publicity stuff kind of made me think I must watch that, but at the same time I do have some friends who've worked on it, so I really should watch it just for that. But we'll see, because I think spy fiction, we won't go too much for today, but spy fiction was a funny one. I always find a lot of the time spy fiction is quite disappointing, and I think the more I learn about the world of espionage, and in my mind I see a lot of possibilities for very interesting stories. I find a lot of spy fiction, because the people who write it don't necessarily have the knowledge of the way it works, tend to go down really silly paths that just become a bit dull. And I'm almost getting to the point, because people keep enthusiastically recommending things to me because, oh, Chris, you like spy stuff. And I'm getting to the point where I feel like I should revert round and say, actually, by default, I don't like spy fiction, but occasionally I do.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm starting to get to that point, but maybe it's just because I'm getting older and more cynical. I don't know. But
yeah, it's so hard. It's so hard for me to watch some of that stuff when you're just pointing out like, no, that's wrong the whole time.
Yeah, there was even stuff in the first series of Slow Horses that I just found a bit disappointing. But maybe we should save that for another conversation. I don't know.
Right. Sure.
But Slow Horses, I think, is a great character drama. But is it a great spy drama? I'm not sure.
Yeah,
that's what I would say.
I'm not sure on that either.
So I will leave it at that. But it is very entertaining and fun, and it's beautifully shot. The locations in London are lovely, and I think I saw them filming a while back, because I've been around that area a bit in the last year and a bit, and I think I've spotted their generators and stuff. So.
They really got that nice London kind of grit to it, that I miss seeing.
Like the Harry Palmer films almost, because that's what I liked about the Ipcris file, has a nice bit of grit to it. And
the old the Michael Caine kind of 70s films and stuff, that were kind of set back then. I mean, the UK has a very nice. I mean, this will be weird to you because you're there all the time, but I think the UK has a kind of texture to it that is unique. It's hard for me to describe it more than that.
Well, yeah, no, I think you're right, and it's beyond phone boxes and red buses, which I generally have a standing ban on when I'm filming now, because I don't like seeing these things on TV, because it just again feels a bit like I've seen it so many times.
You don't go up to the Coldstream guards and make faces at them and try to like distract their horses?
Oh, only like once a month. Yeah, no, try to cut my.
They get mad when you do that.
No, yeah, I've actually never tried it, but I don't think I ever will, because they have guns and stuff. But and as a 41-year-old man, it's probably a bit past me.
No.
But
no way.
I've only ever seen the changing of the guards 3 times. That's all because of my dad, because my dad was really into that. So the last time I saw the change of guards was 2013, so that was 10 years ago this September. So there so there we go. So that's how often I go to Buckingham Palace. Yeah, I
went to the Queen's birthday parade in Horse Guards in summer 2011 and saw all that all that good stuff there.
No, it is quite, it is interesting. I mean, there's me sort of casting a shadow over it all, or a bit of shade on it. But it is kind of interesting to watch, and I certainly understand from a tourist point of view. It's a bit of culture, isn't it? It's a bit of something different that's not necessarily going on in your country. So, I shouldn't completely poo-poo. It's just, I think it's just, as a Londoner, when you see it in every TV show and every movie, and when they play that same song by, is it The Clash, London Calling, I'm like, I just groan. So.
Yeah.
But there we go. But anyway, so London's definitely not calling today. So. Oh, well, Matt, thank you very much. Where can listeners find out more about you, your book, your writings, your musings?
I am on Twitter at Fulton Matt, FULTONMATT, where you can hear my usual rantings and ravings and musings. My website is mattfulton.net, and you can sort of read more about the Active Measures series that I'm doing and other various projects. It's kind of the best place to reach me.
Excellent. Cool. Right, well, take care, and I will catch you in a couple of weeks.
Yep.
And thank you, everybody, for listening. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.